Good morning and happy Sabbath. I'm very thankful to the Lord for His many blessings and that He allowed us to be here once again on this holiday to study His Word. Today we'll continue the topic of stewardship that we have begun several weeks back, and today we'll talk about the safest bank in any economy. And that bank, or the description of that bank, is found in Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 20 and 21, we find written the following: "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." What is this talking about here? This is talking about treasure. It's talking about a Christian life, and it's giving us advice or instructions as far as the investments which we are to make while on this earth. So we've previously discussed and analyzed that Christian stewardship is about living in Christ. It's more than just money, right? It's more than just tithes and offerings. Now, granted, many today think of the first thing is finances. But today we will, through the use of the Matthew chapter 6, verse 20 and 21, point out that, in fact, it goes beyond just financial point. And we have started to discuss this last Sabbath, that the stewardship touches every aspect of Christian discipleship, that it goes to everything inclusive our life, and our choices. So, in this Bible verse, in the book of Matthew, we read there are 3 points that we would like to, that I would like to, given the time, emphasize and bring out. There are three things that are mentioned here. And what are they? First, it mentions moth. Second, it mentions rust. And third, it mentions thieves. So these 3 things will be analyzed today, and we will see how do this combination of these 3, or maybe one of them separately, really makes an impact on my life today. But before we do that, I'd like to bring your attention to a Spirit of Prophecy quote found in Signs of the Times, December 1, 1887, part 9. "Or laying up treasures in heaven points out the duty of an unselfish use of our means. We are stewards of God's possession. They're not ours to use for the gratification of corrupt desires for selfish indulgence." So what does it say here? It talks about laying up treasures, which basically points out the duty of an unselfish use of our means. So this becomes important as we read Matthew chapter 6, because it talks here about this unselfish use of the things which God has given us. So when I read Matthew chapter 6, I'm often reminded of another Bible verse that is found in Proverbs chapter 23. In Proverbs chapter 23, verse 6, we have another Bible verse that talks about treasures. But it says something else. Proverbs 23:4. "Be not rich, cease from thine own wisdom." If you read in the New International Version, Proverbs 23:4, it says, "Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Do not trust your own cleverness." So here the Bible has this, the Bible consistently in the Old and in the New Testament brings to our attention that we are to do what? We are to be mindful that we're not to be in this constant desire or searching for the riches. Because Matthew 6, as we've already pointed out, there's 3 things that can happen to our riches. And let's start now analyzing each one of them. So what does the treasure, or what treasures on earth is Jesus admonishing us to de-emphasize? So the Bible verse in Matthew chapter 20, in 6 chapter 20, begins by saying, lay up for yourselves treasures where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt. So first of all, it mentions here that we all have treasures. And each one of us has some type of treasure. But what type of treasure does the Bible here, or does the Lord wants us to de-emphasize? What type of treasures does the Lord want us not to have? Thank you. As Sister Vicky pointed out, it begins by saying that lay up not for yourself immediate treasures. That's not to say that we're not to save and be intelligent individuals and to be able to provide for our families. No, this talks about something more than that. And we find elaboration of that in the book of Job chapter 20. The increase of his house shall depart, and his goods shall flow away in the day of his wrath. So this talks about an increase. We begin by saying in Matthew chapter 6, where when the Lord tells us to not lay up our treasures, he says to not lay up an increase in our finances on this earth. Proverbs 27:24, it says, for riches are not forever, and doth the crown endure to every generation? Why are we not to have this increase on this earth? Why are we not to be so concerned about an immediate increase on this earth? Because Proverbs said that the riches are not forever. Just like a crown is not held by a person forever, right? He has it for a period and then it's passed on to his, generation back in the day, how it was. The same goes for the riches. The riches are not to be enjoyed forever. Why? That's where we go further and we continue emphasizing, or we continue studying Matthew chapter 6. So among ancient treasures, riches, wealth consistent of clothing. And in addition to clothing, back in the day, those that were considered rich, they possessed gold, silver, clothing, wine, land, and oil. These 7 things are some of the basic determination of the wealth or the richness of one individual. But when it talks about a treasure or laying up our treasure, what does it really mean? Have you ever thought, what does it mean to lay up treasure? Basically, through my study of the Bible and through the reading of Matthew chapter 6 and understanding it, the conclusion that I came to, that laying up treasures means that an abundance of anything conducive to the ornamentation or comfort of life was considered treasure. Do you get what I'm saying? An abundant to the pleasures of life was considered treasures. That's not to say that you're not to have your basic needs met, but that excessive or over the board retention of goods, be it land, wine, or oil, or silver or gold, this is where the Lord admonished the Israelites to not lay up treasures for themselves, meaning to not have an abundance of anything conducive to the ornamentation or comfort of life that was at that point considered treasures. I would like to continue reading in Signs of the Times, page December 1, 1987, part 9, where it says, laying up treasure in heaven points out the duty of an unselfish use of our means. We're stewards of God's possession, and shall we prove unfaithful, we shall be called to give an account of our stewardship. It is not ours to use for the gratification of corrupt desires, for selfish indulgence. God has placed His goods in our hands for the purpose of sustaining His cause on earth, for the salvation of the lost, and for His own honor. This is why the Lord has given you a good job. He has given you any job. He gifted you with talents. Why? That you may use those talents for the purpose of sustaining His cause on earth and for the salvation of lost. Okay? So we started by reading Matthew chapter 6 and identifying that God is giving you treasures. But the Bible also tells us that we are not to lay up treasures for ourselves, treasures on earth. And when we speak of treasures on earth, it means gaining in abundance or in excess that which we already have in contentment. Does that make sense? I want you to understand what it really means to have treasures on this earth. It means basically when we're gaining in addition to what we already have. In addition to the means to, maybe we have one house, we want another one. Maybe we have one type of car, we want another one. Maybe we have one type of thing, we want another one. And when traced back to the Israelites, it meant oil, silver, gold, clothing, land, and many other things. But in our day to day, we just as well can be those Israelites that are laying up treasures on earth. How? We can just as well be trying to secure those beautiful and rich ornaments and apparels, though we are not securing gold and silver like they did. But in our days, it could be land, cars, CDs, DVDs, clothing. It can be different things for different people. And this is the thing that, as I was studying this, just because you're poor or you don't make much money doesn't mean that you're necessarily secured from laying up treasures for yourself on earth. I want to talk a little bit about this for a minute. Just because you live in poverty or on a, you make little money per se, you don't make, let's say you just make barely enough to get by, does not necessarily guarantee that you're secured from falling in this trap of securing up treasures for yourself. Okay? And we'll talk about that in just a few brief moments. So, now that we understand that the Bible speaks here, what does the Bible really mean when it speaks of laying up treasures? Let's go back to the book of Matthew and read the second part of verse 20. In Matthew chapter 6, the second part of verse 20, what does it say here? Lay up not for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt. So let's talk about moth. What does moth signify? To us, wealth is money, land, houses, and cars. But in biblical terms, as I've already mentioned earlier, clothing was a key part of man's wealth. For example, how do we know that clothing was an important piece of their wealth back then? Well, go back to Genesis chapter 45. In Genesis chapter 45, verse 22, what does it say there? To all of them he gave each man charge of raiment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment. This talks about Joseph. And if you think back to the beginning history of Joseph, at which point were his brothers fed up with the behavior of his father towards Joseph? It was with the coat. So the reason why I read these Bible verses is to illustrate that back in the day, clothing was a very important piece of their riches, or a piece that basically signified the amount of wealth that they've gained. But not only that, Joshua chapter 7 verse 7 and 21. And when I saw among the spoils of godly Babylonish garments, and 200 shekels of silver, and wedged of gold, and 50 shekels of weight, then I coveted them, and took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth, in the midst of my tent, and silver under it. What does it say here? What did Achan covet first? Clothing. Okay? And there are a couple more Bible verses that we're not going to read for the sake of time. So, part of clothing's apparel to them was the ability to make a display. Back from the Israeli time, clothing to them was when you wore the clothing, you displayed to the people around you, be it in the temple or on the street or in the market, the amount of wealth that you possessed. Okay? So the garments of the rich were impressively colorful, and they had gold woven into the clothing and so forth. But moths were the most destructive force against such treasures. That's why the Bible here tells us to not lay up treasures on this earth where things can deteriorate it. Now, what's unique about a moth? What's so interesting about this actual tiny creature of a moth? It eats clothes. But I want to really emphasize the size of the moth. How big is a moth? It's very small. Although a moth is very, very tiny, very small, it has a power to destroy a beautiful clothing which is ruined and is no good for use anymore. Why do you think the Lord here used an illustration of a moth? Because sometimes these little sins are so tiny, but they can drive our imagination and our desire and perhaps our entire life choice for the gain of the riches. And these little moths, these little sins, can be a destroyer of our entire life, of what's so precious to us, or what we regard as so precious. So, second part that I want to emphasize is the size of the moth. I'm just laying these principles. We're going to come back and tie them together at the end. So just bear in mind and memorize. So we started with treasures, and we talked about not laying up an abundance of anything that you need on this earth. Then we went over to moth, and we emphasized the size of the moth and that it eats from the outside in. And then we go to the third point, which is the second part of verse 20 of Matthew chapter 6. What does it say there? Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt. Let's talk about rust. What does rust symbolize? Proverbs chapter 23 verse 4 and 5. Proverbs chapter 23 verse 4 and 5, it says, Labor not to be rich. Cease from thine own wisdom. Wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away as an eagle toward heaven. So Proverbs chapter 23 begins by telling us that we're not to labor to be rich. Okay? Now what does that mean? James chapter 5 verse 3 continues this thought. James chapter 5 verse 3. Your gold and silver is crackened, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasures together for the last days. So in Proverbs we read about not having riches or not securing riches. And again, we already established what type of riches it really talks about according to Matthew chapter 6. It doesn't necessarily mean that meeting your basic needs, but it means when people go into the successive and abundant saving of things, okay? And then in James chapter 5 verse 3, it talked about the gold and silver that is cankered, thank you. And the rust of them shall be a witness, meaning that the rust shall be a witness. What does that really mean? I'd like to read this Bible verse in New Living Translation, where it says, Your gold and silver have become worthless. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. So why do I bring these things when in reference to rust? Rust represents anything that eats into, okay? Where does rust really begin? Rust begins on the outside. On the inside, and then it eats out, it kind of uncovers the whole piece of metal or gold or what have you. This is what rust does. Unlike moth, and sometimes rust does begin on the outside due to water or whatever, but there are times when rust begins on the inside due to moisture or the condition of preservance or things like that. So if moth eats on the outside, rust digs from the inside out and digs up your treasure and destroys things that are more durable than clothing. So you see where we're coming from here. We start by identifying what are treasures. We then go into identifying moth, that it eats your immediate things, your temporal things, your clothing, your things that are of value to you. But then rust, it digs deeper. Rust begins to deteriorate your more durable things that you thought would last your lifetime. This is where rust comes in, and rust begins to deteriorate them. So in this parable that we read in Matthew chapter 6, it is a wider application than a mere iron oxide. Okay? What is really, when you read Matthew chapter 6, now that we understand that each one of these things means a lot more than just moth or just rust or just treasures, what do you think, what type of thought is stimulated in your mind? Rusting or oxidation will eventually corrode all metal, including silver and gold. Similarly to our physical treasures, rust or anything that eats into one thing will eventually deteriorate our treasures on this earth. And once moth or rust begins to settle on a subject, have you seen where you can prevent a moth from eating it? Now, yes, you can use certain other remedies, wood or whatever, place around that clothing or piece of clothing to prevent the moth from eating. But the moth has already destroyed that garment that you so much cherished. So now that we understand that there are objects that can eat from the outside, there are objects that can eat from the inside, we go to the last part of Matthew chapter 20, which says, and what does it say? Matthew chapter 6 verse 20. And where thieves do not break through nor steal. We go into a physical involvement of something external into our life. So first we identify things that are circumstances or our life choices that may lead to the destroying of our treasures, moth and rust being, things from the outside of our life, things from the inside of our life. But now we go into last part, which talks about thieves that can break and steal. Who do thieves represent? When reading in the Bible, who do thieves represent? Isaiah chapter 56 verse 10 and 12. Isaiah chapter 56 verse 10 and 12. Who do thieves represent? His watchmen are blind. They're all ignorant. Isaiah 56, 10 and 12. They're all dumb dogs. They cannot bark, sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. Yea, they're greedy dogs, which can never have enough. And they are shepherds that cannot understand. They all look to their own way, every one for his gain, from his quarter. Come ye, say they, I will fetch wine, and I will fill ourselves with strong drink, and tomorrow we shall be as this day, and much more abundant. Why do we begin by reading in the Old Testament about thieves? Because thieves can be many things in our life, and many people. So we read in Isaiah chapter 56 that where it begins by saying that his watchmen are blind. Who do watchmen represent? Back in the day, watchmen were the ones that guarded the walls. But here, Isaiah says that when watchmen are blind, they're ignorant, they're all as dumb dogs. What do these watchmen let come through the wall? Thieves or enemies. So it begins with a watchman. If you don't have a strong watchman in your life, who is Jesus Christ, if you don't have those guards up, that's when thieves can come in. And how do thieves come in? Luke chapter 10 verse 30. And Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. So thieves can attack us at any point in our life. Okay? This man, according to Luke chapter 10 verse 30, was traveling not knowing that anything may happen to him. So in Isaiah we read, by identifying that if we let our guard down, and as we travel on a journey of life, anything can really come upon us and do what to us? Destroy, harm. But John chapter 10 verse 1 continues by saying, John chapter 10 verse 1, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. Verse 8, all that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. And verse 10, and thief cometh not for to steal and to kill and to destroy, for I am come that they might have life, and that they might have life more abundantly. So we here begin by analyzing several points. We begin by reading in Isaiah that we are to have a watch, a guard about us at all time. And when that guard is let down, two things can happen to us. We can either be attacked by circumstances and people and things in our life that may steal our treasures from us, or John chapter 1, these type of thieves may come upon us unaware. They may creep up on us. Though I may think that I may have my guard down, my guard up, and I'm secure and everything. It says here that not everything it may not be so obvious to us that the thief is coming upon us. Because it says here that thieves may not necessarily enter through the door, but how? Climb some other way. That's the point about thieves. In order for us to guard ourselves against spiritual thieves and against circumstances which can steal things from us, we must, according to Isaiah chapter 56, have a guard around us and be watchful. Okay? So, houses in Middle East were frequently made of sun-baked stones or clay. And because of this, it was fairly easy for thieves to dig through the hole with some sort of tools and penetrate the house. So what now that we read Isaiah, Luke, and John, what do you think thieves represent? Thieves represent ungodly world around us that continually seeks. And what does it seek to do? It takes to take everything that we have and return us nothing but trouble. This is what thieves do. They seek to take things away from you. This ungodly world that surrounds us, it wishes to take things from you. It doesn't want to give anything to you other than trouble. So moth and rust attack consumable things, right? Attack consumable things, attack things that are tangible. But thieves, they look to steal this treasure for themselves. But why is in Matthew chapter 6 the Lord chose to put all three metaphors or illustrations into one parable? Why did he choose the metaphor of the moth, the rust, and thieves to be merged into one lesson? Did you ever ask yourself that? Why did the Lord so important or necessary to talk about the treasure, and in order to help us better understand treasure and what it means for me today, he gave us an illustration through a moth, through a rust, and through thieves. Jesus wanted to point to our attention the futility of a earth-centered life. Does that make sense? Because if my life is earth-centered, if what is important to me is on this earth and I'm centered upon it, one way or another, one of these things is bound to happen. Whether it's circumstances from the outside, whether it's circumstances from the inside my family. Maybe it could be a health thing that comes from the inside, from my family, and I have to give all my money away. Or it may be that a family is in need and I have to give all my money away. Or stealing, that things from the outside may come in and take that which was ours at some point. So here, through this illustration, Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 6 wanted to illustrate to his listeners and to us today, years later, the futility of an earth-centered life. With that being said, let's read in Signs of the Times, December 1, 1887, paragraph 12. Signs of the Times, December 1, 1887, paragraph 12. The constant employment of the capabilities to amass wealth on earth binds man to earth. He becomes a slave to mammon. When wealth increases, the idolatrous heart becomes forgetful of God and grows self-secure and satisfied. Religious duties are neglected. There is an impatience manifested under restraint, and the man becomes self-sufficient. All spiritual things are clouded. For the mind's eyes is directed earthward. The worldly tendencies, both by nature and practice, have become more fully developed, and the spiritual faculties are paralyzed. What happens when we let our guard down and we begin to amass wealth on this earth? There's a couple immediate things, practical things that happen. The idolatrous heart becomes forgetful of God. We start missing church. We start missing prayer meeting. We start missing some other church activities or things where our presence is needed, and grow self-secure and satisfied. This is what happens. We become self-secure. We become secure in what we have. We think that what I have is sufficient and I'm secure with it. Nothing can happen to me. And lastly, religious duties are neglected. What is asked of me in the church, the things that either cleaning or organizing or helping with something, we don't do it. We simply don't do it because why? I either stay at my job too long, or I can't do it for one or another reason, because my job requires me to, or because I don't have the time. These are some of the practical and immediate things that Spirit of Prophecy tells us that will happen or happens when we fail to realize that we're laying up treasures on this earth. Okay? So, what type of treasures are we to lay for ourselves in heaven? Now that we understand what type of treasures we're not to lay and where not to lay, we need to talk about the treasures we ought to lay. In the last few minutes of this study, we'll talk about the treasures we are to lay for ourselves in heaven. Go back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 20 and 21. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Here, we read again Matthew chapter 6, and I wanted to reemphasize that the Lord here tells us to lay our treasures in heaven. So when I asked you earlier what type of treasures we are to lay for ourselves, we are to lay out for ourselves heavenly treasures. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 2 continues this thought. It says, "Wherefore do you spend money for that which is not bread, and you labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." This is where we get down to a practical application of Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6 it said, "Do not lay for yourselves treasures which are on this earth, but lay up where? In heaven." In Isaiah it says, "Why do you spend money on that which is not bread?" Bread meaning eternal life. And why do we labor for that which is not satisfied? When we do things which are not for, or we are so preoccupied with the gain that will not yield or benefit our eternal life, this is where Jesus lovingly and strongly rebuked the Israelites in Matthew. Because he said, "Where your heart is, there will" what? "Will be your, or where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." So in conclusion, lying up or saving or storing is not sinful in itself. But Paul enjoys earnest industry, and he talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 14. Paul never discouraged people from working hard and saving and being wise with their finances. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 14, where Paul says, "Behold, the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you. For I seek not yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children." Paul here emphasizes and enjoys the honest industry and wise enterprise. What does he say here? "I don't want anything that you have." Did you know that Paul was a self-sustained missionary? He wasn't paid by the church. He paid himself. That's right. So here Paul emphasizes and he speaks about or he brings out the fact that an honest industry and wise enterprise is good, because that's what he used for sustaining of his work. And if wealth does come our way, how are we to handle it? How are we to handle if we do become wealthy through one or another reason, we work hard or the Lord blesses us abundantly? How are we to use that wealth? What are we to do with that wealth? Okay? What do we read in Luke chapter 12 verse 33? What type of riches are we to seek? "Sell that what you have and give alms. Provide yourselves bags which wax not old, and treasures in the heavens that faileth not, where no teeth approaches, neither moth corrupteth." We must seek the right goals, not physical riches, but spiritual sound treasures, according to Luke chapter 12 verse 33. These sound treasures, how are these sound treasures to be sought? How are these sound treasures to be sought, and how are they to be shared with others? What will be the result of these riches when these riches of heaven will be in our heart? What will be the result of them? Revelation chapter 14 verse 13. "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Why do I read this Bible verse in relation to the riches and the wealth? Because our deeds or the deeds of kindness, our works, is what will follow the profession of our faith. Earlier in Luke, we read that we're not to lay ourselves treasures, but we're to sell that which we have and give alms, meaning we're to use that which we have. Earlier I asked you a question, if I do have the wealth, what am I to do with it? We're to use that wealth for the edifying, for helping of the poor, helping of the needy, and helping the cause of the Lord. Because, and by this, by the acts of this practical missionary work, by the acts of these kind works, is what, according to Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, will follow us into heaven. Does that make sense? I'm trying to here illustrate that Matthew chapter 6, it talks more about just an immediate treasure on this earth. It brings out and illustrates that there are things in life which, like moth, which may from the outside begin eating away our treasure. Then there are things in life like rust from the inside begin to eat our treasures. Then there are things, the circumstances around us which are not controlled by us may come into our life and take things away from us. But we are to lay for ourselves treasures in heaven. And what type of treasures are those? Good works. Those are the treasures of active missionary work, as illustrated in Revelation chapter 14 verse 13, is what will follow us into heaven. Our character, which will be illustrated and emphasized or brought into practice, into actionable practice through our works. Why do I want to emphasize this? Why am I repeating myself several times? Is to help us understand that the character formed by our deeds is a result of those spiritual goods which are within us. The amount of work that I do and I'm willing to put into even the church or helping the needy is the illustration, is the immediate illustration of the amount of spiritual wealth that I possess in my heart. My friends, my dear brothers and sisters, I pray that we may ask the Lord for the spiritual riches, because once we have those, we won't be so worried about the immediate physical riches on this earth. May Lord help us, and may we practice and apply this in our life daily. Amen.